Hello, hello, everybody. How are we today? Okay, good. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. My name is Sarah Colley. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Great Falls Public Library. It is my honor to have you all here as we have our second program regarding National Women's Day, which was last Saturday. And, you know, we talked about feisty women all last week, and this group that we're going to be talking about is definitely part of those feisty women of Montana. So thank you for coming out. If you need to use the restroom at any point in time, that is out the door and to the right. Emergency exits are also out the door to the right and then to the right again. In case of an emergency, please don't take the elevator. So with that, today's presenter is my dear friend Leigh Larson. Leigh is a storyteller. Whether it's writing, speaking, filming, or digital designing, Miss Larson aims to make stories relatable, entertaining, and memorable for her audiences. She completed her undergraduate at the University of Texas at Austin with a bachelor's in international relation and a minor's in environmental science and world religion/philosophy. She worked in Texas politics prior to serving as a minister in the U.S. Air Force Chaplain Corps and for a church in Denver. She successfully helped start a recovery nonprofit before growing her skills in tech as a web and graphic designer before launching her web and graphic design business full-time. Leigh is an incredible part of our community, and we are happy to have her here today. So with that, please join me in welcoming Leigh Larson to the stage.
Testing? All right, cool. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Jake, of the Great Falls Public Library. Can you all hear me all right? All right, great. My name is Leigh Larson. Thank you so much for coming out this Tuesday for Women's History Month and Women's International Women's Day last weekend. As stated, we'll be talking about some feisty women. This is an incredible part of Montana history, of Indigenous women's history, and it's a story that it's just a really incredible story. So I'm excited for you all to be here, and thank you. All right, so as stated, my name is Leigh Larson. I am a historian. I focus a lot on women and Indigenous people. As we talked about earlier, I'm a USOF Reserve Chaplain Corps veteran. Went to UT, got a master's in theological studies at Phillips Theological Seminary down in Oklahoma. A children's book author. The story Adventures of Miss Lee and Professor Huckleberry, where my dog narrates national parks to children. And in fact, I got a call today that Glacier National Park will be carrying my books. So it's super exciting. My mother's line is Cherokee, and that's a big part of what started this. Was my brother and I were looking into research of our own family down in Texas, and it took us through Oklahoma and up into South and North Carolina. And as I was learning my history, learning Montana's history, learning Indigenous history, women's history, I stumbled on the Fort Shaw girls basketball team story, became enamored with it. This was probably back in November, and wound up submitting a 30-page paper on it to the North American Society of Sports History. Just to say, like, this is an incredible story. I hope that Disney movies picks it up like they did Remember the Titans. So we'll go through introduction real quick. Yes, this is on the Fort Shaw Indian Boarding School girls basketball team, but in order to really tell their story, I have to talk about the context. So I'm going to build this world, what was going on in the Indian boarding schools, what was the St. Louis World's Fair, why is it important, and then we'll go right into the awesome story of the Fort Shaw girls. I hope that you walk away today knowing a little bit more about Indian boarding schools, about St. Louis World Fair, and of course about Fort Shaw as both a fort, military fort, and as a boarding school. And why their championship was just so much more than basketball. It is an incredible story. It is fun just looking at the numbers and stats from their playing time, but really when we talk about the context in this world I'm about to take you into, it's a big deal. And it's romantic. You know, how can you not be romantic about sports? And then of course, just be more inspired by history, the work of women, and indigenous people. So, a note on the sources. So for anybody, has anyone read Full Court Quest or familiar with it? Okay. So Full Court Quest was written by Linda Peavy and Ursula Smith in 2008, or published in 2008. It is a tome of a book. It's got to be like 400 pages, incredibly well researched, lots of respect and appreciation for those women taking that endeavor. And then since 2008, since that publication, which is weird to wrap our heads that it's been almost 20 years since that book has been published. Yeah, right. A lot more research and information has been made publicly available about Native boarding schools, indigenous boarding schools. Lots of funding has gone into it, lots of authors, of course, the websites and online and all that material. But I think since 2009, the Native American Boarding School Coalition has been established, and they have been instrumental in gathering a lot more data. So thank you to Ms. Peavy and Ursula Smith for taking this on. And then of course we will be adding to their research with all the information we now have. Furthermore, Montana State University's Robert Rydell is where I collected a lot of my research on the St. Louis World's Fair. So we'll be looking at documents from the National Archives and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then I visited Fort Shaw several times and contacted the Sun River Valley Historical Society. So, before there was ever the WNBA, there was the Fort Shaw Indian Boarding School girls basketball team. This is their story. So the Indian boarding schools did not start with our federal government. They started as early as the 1600s with schools like Harvard, Dartmouth, Princeton, William and Mary. These colleges funded are all Christian denominational colleges. They were funded primarily with money coming over from England, from Europe, starting schools over here, and very much incentivized to attract, recruit, and Americanize, really Christianize the local populations over in the Northeast. By 1818, the House Committee report stated that the sons of the forest should be moralized or exterminated. So this was the sentiment of the U.S. government at this day. Now the goal of these schools was to strip the Native people of their customs, their traditions, their appearances, their language. They were doing everything to remove the Indianness from them and to assimilate them into an Americanized Christianity. Now, it really took up speed in the 1860s, right after, we'll get into it, but the Civil War devastated much of the South, and also the American government incentivized people to go west through the form of land allotments and other acts. So we start to see a lot more conflict, Indian American conflict, as people started to go west. Again, is to fully remove the Indianness from these people and to instill Christian values. I don't know if this is a pointer or not, but this is an old map from the National Park Services. Don't remember what year it is, but it says it's got something like 26 schools on there. What we know now is it's more like 400. Yeah, something like 500,000 kids went through these schools. It is hard to determine how many truly, because it happened over the course of 400 years, and a lot of them weren't documented. A lot of the documentation came after the Civil War. But it started again with these Christian schools, Harvard, these colleges that I mentioned earlier. A lot of churches got involved, lots of nuns and Christian women teachers that were teaching these young Native American kids how to be American, or how to speak English, or how to read in English. And And that also ranges. Some of it was violent, some of it was neutral, however you want to say that. But those schools, predominantly ran by the Christian churches and the Christian schools, were near their reservations. Maybe the kids would come for the day or for the week, but then they would go back home to their families. What changed was when the military got involved, and they treated it like a military institution, where they took kids from their families and took them very far away. So this is where we see this very drastic change of kids being able to go home. A lot of it was Civil War hero Captain Pratt. He was a military trainer. He's Civil War, like I said, Civil War hero. He also fought out in the West in some of the American Indian Wars out West. He was in charge of running a military installation in Florida. They sent a bunch of Native American prisoner of war to him. He tried to assimilate them into Americanized Christian upstanding men, and was like, I'm having a real hard time trying to get these adults to change their ways. I think these Christian boarding schools are onto something, but they're just not doing it right. Just target the kids, but we're going to do it my way. And also, a lot of folks have asked, why? Why do we want to educate them? Would it not have been cheaper to continue the genocide? Would it not have been cheaper to do the reservations, etc.? And actually, it wasn't. To keep a standing U.S. cavalry cost roughly $2 million for every Native American that was killed in the Out West Wars. Cost roughly $1 million by the time you supplies, structures, housing, staffing, horses, that was another thing. But if you were going to educate one child over an 8-year period, it cost $1,200. So that's when they started switching to schools. We'll just build these schools and essentially feed them beans, mosh, whatever you want to call it. Now, and that's what really killed the military conquests. And Captain Pratt famously said, "We'll kill the Indian and we'll save the man." I won't make you read all of these, but these are direct screenshots from the report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1872. These are pulled from the Montana section. On the first line, again, I'm not going to go through both of it, but he's not satisfied that the Christianization or civilization of any of the Indians in this agency, I'm not satisfied with success. And it's, they don't care to be Americanized. They don't care to come to our education. Now, this is in 1872. And even down on the second, it talks about the Blackfeet nor the Milk River Agency show any disposition to engage in farming. So they're mad that they're not farming. They're mad that they're not sending their kids to their schools. And that's how the American government is talking about it. Look at this opportunity. We're giving them farms, and we're going to take their kids and put them in education. And they're not happy for some reason. As we move 18 years later, we see the sentiment again. But here, this one up top, talks about how they're starting to change the attitudes because now the buffalo are being killed off. So they're saying, okay, maybe they are going to switch over into farming now that we have killed their main food source. The second one on the right basically talks about how we're going to start targeting kids. So then this is 1890, and then by 1905, which is a year after the Indian girls basketball team played, it talks about what an opportunity these schools are for these families. So we see over time, just with the point of these 3 slides was to show that the American government was winning, quote unquote. In 1872, they were really struggling to get people to farm, to get the kids to go to these schools. And then by 1905, they're starting to talk about, well, hey, now they see it as an opportunity. Not quite. So the Indians, the U.S. soldiers and ministers came in the middle of the night. Sometimes they took kids by gunpoint. Sometimes, and then also, this Luther Standing Bear of the Lakota tribe said, I thought we were going east to die. Actually, I'm going to stay west, sorry. But so well had courage and bravery been trained to us, I was proving to my father that he was honored with a brave son. So you see these kids like getting on these trains, have no idea what's going on, and they're just hoping and praying that their parents instilled courage and bravery all the way to the end. As mentioned, there were 3 tiers. There was the day school, which was predominantly what the Christian schools did. It was on or near the reservation, but it was very close by to their families. And the off-reservation is what the government implemented. Boys typically were educated in all sorts of things, whereas the girls were trained in domestic housework. I do want to mention that this also influenced later Nazi methods of how the Nazis rounded up non-Aryan and Jew folks onto their trains and sent them to camps. And in fact, they directly worked with the American government on that. So at these schools, these kids were separated from their culture, cut their hair, given English names. They were dressed in military uniforms. They were commanded to speak only in English. They were even given military rankings, which is crazy to think about a bunch of children running around with rankings, but that's what they did. They were marched around these different schools. And if you think government-funded programs are lacking now, just imagine what it would have been like back in the 1800s and 1900s. The food was not great. The food storage was not great. There was lack of heating and insulation. Little winter clothing and footwear. There were kids that got frostbite in the winter, that froze or died in the winter. And they were beaten if they ever tried to speak to one another in their native tongue. So pictures for how these kids were changed. So taken pretty young. These girls have to be no more than 5, 6 years old in this one. So that brings us to Fort Shaw Indian Boarding School. Now Fort Shaw did have a better reputation than other schools in the region. That is also a thing about these. There were schools, most of these were forts that got converted into schools, and depending on how well funded that fort was, also informed how much the boarding school was going to be formed. So Fort Shaw was considered one of the nicest forts out here. And it was called the Queen of Montana's Indian Forts. I strongly suggest anyone to go out to Fort Shaw and tour, check it out. It's pretty incredible. But like we said, over time, based on the documents I showed you earlier from the Indian Bureau of Indian Affairs, the sentiment was changing as the people were realizing their culture was dying. And so they, instead of fighting, they started willingly sending their kids to these schools. And a lot of them, like I said, Fort Shaw had a better reputation, better quality, cleaning education, treatment standards, etc. It also helped that it was nearby the Sun River. Just having that access to water, wind, can do a lot for hygiene and sanitation. And like I said, children by the 1890s, 1900s were being willingly sent by their families, either because the families had started to give up, like just go, learn this English, just go before someone steals you, or because a lot of the indigenous women were marrying white men. So this infiltration, but this sort of like, things were now starting to become blended, and I wouldn't say that people were like excited to send their kids to these places, but it wasn't the sort of forced thing and by gunpoint that it was even 30, 40 years before. So, what does this have to do with St. Louis? So St. Louis World's Fair, there were many World's Fairs back in the day. That was like, to understand what these World Fairs were, like the Chicago World Fair, the Portland World, there was also these World's Fair. They were like the equivalent of like a tech company conference. Like everybody was going, there was all this media noise about it, all the latest and greatest science and tech inventions were there, food, it was just like the place to be. Now in St. Louis, it showed advancements in tech, science, and food. This was a chance for the American government to show how great they were, to show all the progress they've made, just and really kind of toot their own horn. This one specifically, it was in St. Louis. I'll call it the St. Louis World's Fair, but if you see any abbreviation of LP, it was in honor of the 100-year anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase. So the following year, I want to say, was the 1905 Portland. I want to say it was Portland's World Fair, and that was in honor of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So they typically took something that was historical to America and built around it. Now, 19 million people came over a 7-month period from around the world. And you got to think about in 1904, how the ships were. You know, these were not Disney cruises. And people came from all over the world to St. Louis World's Fair for this. And big hullabaloo. Like I said, it was the place to be. And the federal government's invested almost $500 million in today's money into these fairs. All of the buildings that you see were constructed for the fair. This is where they introduced hot dogs and Coca-Cola and waffle cones and x-ray machines and incubators for preterm infants and electric streetcar. They had a Ferris wheel. Like, they went all out. People traveled from all over to see these marvels. So while you're also looking at the marvels, they had all these inventions and science and tech and etc. They also had the anthropology village as like a direct contrast to what you were looking at. Look at us, we did the train and the streetcar, and look at what we, look at these other communities and groups that we're so superior to. So there's the anthropology village, the Indian Hill. They had living exhibits and human zoos, and it was really a comparison between this modernity and then this indigenous, historical, look at these primitive savages type contrast. They also had a Filipino reservation. The anthropology village was pretty much headed up by a man, W.L. McGee. Sorry that I forgot his initials. But W.L. McGee was an anthropologist from the Northeast who had been disgraced. He had really pushed for some pretty intense racist and sexist anthropology theories and had been discredited. But he knew how to market. He knew how to get the people talking. And that was one reason why the fair organizers hired him to be the anthropology village guy. Even though his science was debunked, whatever you want to call it, they knew that he could get the people talking. So it turns out making a lot of noise is not something where, it's not just part of 2025 and our current affairs, but it's been going on for a while. So he had laboratories set up in this village to showcase skeletons, brains, bodies of deceased people, some white people, some non-white, to say, hey, look at the superiority of the white person compared to the non-white person. Look at the physical, look at the brain capacity, look at all these things. And really argued that the white person, the white male, was just superior in every way, from brain capacity to skeleton to mass, etc. Wait, did I come back? Yes, okay. So the Filipino reservation, they had, 1898, America acquired Philippines during the Spanish-American War. It was a concession. Spain used to have the Philippines, and that was part of the deal, was that we now, America, got the Philippine territories. But the Filipinos were not exactly happy about that at all, and they waged armed resistance to the American government when the American government came in. And the American government was like, you know what, we're gonna make a mockery of that. So they brought in 1,100 Filipinos, trafficked them in. They came by boat into California, and then rode unheated train cars from California to St. Louis, Missouri in the winter. Some of them did not survive. And again, this was to show like how savage these people are, and thank God that the American government is here. The St. Louis World's Fair, 1904, the Indian Hill. Was another example of let's show the fairgoers like the differences. What has the American government done for the Native Americans since acquiring so much land and people under the Louisiana Purchase? So they brought in about 500 Native Americans from 14 different tribes across the Louisiana Purchase. Didn't matter if these tribes got along or were friendly or anything, and they kind of put them all in the same area and said, figure it out for the next 7 months. They built this school to where you could go upstairs, and on one side of the hallway were young kids reciting Shakespeare or the Constitution or reading English books, math, science, and then on the other side were the adults that were in traditional indigenous clothing, weaving baskets, jewelry, etc., to say, like, look, this is what the American government has done. Otherwise, these kids would end up like these adults. So just like kind of even hard to wrap our head around. I didn't know this about any of this. Here's a bit about the human zoos and exhibits. It was very performative. So that's what brings us to the Fort Shaw Indian Boarding School. Here's the roster. Here's taking a picture taken from the monument out at Fort Shaw with our names, Rose, Flora Lucero, Katie Snell, Minnie Burton, Genevieve Healy, Sarah Mitchell, Emma Sansaber, Jean Butch, Bill Johnson, and Nettie Worth. These are not the only girls on the team. This was just a starting roster. I want to be clear about that. We're not going to go through every one of these girls, but I do want to point out how many of these girls that were on this is just of the team. Some of the girls on the team. How many different tribes that were represented? Because again, a lot of people were coming to these boarding schools, and they brought their animosity. They brought their histories with them. So as we see a lot of different tribes represented. Not all of them got along. And then of course, as I mentioned early on in the presentation, how many of these girls, but also just in general at this point in American history, were also of mixed blood. So we have a lot of German fathers, white fathers, European, Spanish immigrant, etc. So things are changing as people are blending families and cultures. So, about 13 years before, 12 years before these girls emerged on the scene, basketball wasn't invented. It was invented to be a Christian sport because it was still masculine, but it wasn't as aggressive as like football or other contact sports. It was developed by James Naismith. He was a professor at a Christian university, and he published it in the YMCA magazine, and it took off. He would post rules and guidelines and all sorts of things. And at the same time, probably about 5 years later or so, Coach Campbell was named the director over at Fort Shaw. He loved the school game of basketball. And when he came, he not only introduced it to his Fort Shaw kids, but he also introduced it to a bunch of locals, like in the Cascade region, so that these kids would have other people to play against. You'll see that I mentioned that he's student beloved. Coach Campbell, I want to say he was at least poor working class, but he was raised near other Indians, near other Native Americans, and did not have the same sort of animosity that was going on with people in the urban areas out east. He knew them, he was friends with them. He didn't see that sort of racial superiority going on, and really was just trying to keep things running. A guy who needed a job. He played baseball growing up. He loved sports, but he was not someone who wanted to come in with some sort of iron fist when we talk about this, and we'll talk about it. It's cool. Now, many of the school children had never played basketball. Why not? Because it was invented just 10, 15 years before. But it was very similar to the Indian field game of shinny ball and double ball. The students learned quickly. Another big reason why, especially the girls learned it, was because historically, indigenous communities celebrated females' athleticism. In fact, that was a form of courting. Some of the men would come and watch girls do things out in the field or in the forest or on the river, and if a girl knew how to handle her weight and her athletic prowess, like, it made for a good mate. It meant that she was strong, she had a good body that could not only reproduce, but also could carry its own. It was something that was very valued, and I put that in direct contrast to, the white woman who's been told to wear dresses and stay at home in the kitchen, be ladylike, don't sweat. Totally different. So that'll play a role here in a bit. There was a student that went through, Josephine Langley, and she was a student, and then she came back and stayed on as the girls' basketball coach. So again, Coach Campbell ran the sports, but even his willingness and openness to having an indigenous female be a coach or to have a leadership position says a lot about where he was in that day. Which is actually very typical of Western folk back then. They were a lot more egalitarian compared to the Southern Bible Belt and to the Victorian New England. Okay, it took them like 2 seconds to smoke everybody. These girls came out so hard, so fast. They were not afraid to sweat. They were not afraid to throw an elbow. Very much, they picked up that game very quickly. They went all around the state, even as far as Butte, kind of all in this sort of region. And again, by wagon, so we gotta think about that. And then not only these girls that you're looking at were between the ages of 12 to 17, and they're out here smoking the Montana agriculture and Montana State University colleges and universities. Like, these are college girls, and these middle school and high school girls are coming out and smoking them. They wound up winning the state championship that year, made a whole lot of press, really exciting. And of course, Coach Campbell was extremely proud. But with all that positive press came the invitation to the fair. So Louisiana Purchase Exposition organizers called Coach Campbell. They said, we love what you're doing out there. We've heard a lot of good things about this Fort Shaw School, and we would love it if you could send out a delegate to come out and talk about how you've Americanized these students and how well they're adapting to the American ways, and then also it'd be nice if you could show them how they're playing this American Christian game of basketball. That's real amusing. And so we want them to dress up in their Indian regalia, and then we also want them to turn around and dress into more modern American clothing as well. We want them to play 2 different roles. And Coach Campbell actually really wrestled with this invitation. He didn't just like, oh yeah, sure, sounds great. Again, he knew what was going on. These fairs, they took anywhere from like 2 to 5 years to build. And it was very much in the press. This was not the first fair either. He knew what was going on and was like, well, I shouldn't speak for these girls. I'm going to take the invitation to them. I'm going to tell them what's going on as clear as possible, and we'll let them make the decision. And that's what he did. He said, listen, girls, this isn't just a basketball game with, the Montana press taking photos. This is an exhibition. This is a way to show that the American white man has come so far, and look at what they've done to the Aboriginal maidens. And on one hand, you will see things you've never seen before, right? These are Montana girls going to St. Louis. How exciting. On the other hand, here are the motives. And the girls talked it over, and they were like, you know what? Let's show them what these Aboriginal maidens are all about. Let's do it. So, feisty Women's Week. So, after years of Native Americans being told that they couldn't wear their regalia, they were then asked to put on their regalia. So there was some irony there. They had to fund their way to the trip, fund their stay in St. Louis. So they sang and they danced and they played musical instruments like the mandolin. And they played basketball along the way. They participated in the mock Indian school exhibit, and then in their free time, again, these are middle school and high school girls, they're running out in the fair. They're eating hot dogs and candy and getting sick on Coca-Cola and having themselves a grand old time. But again, after years of being told that to be Indian is the worst thing in the world, they were asked to dress buck up as such through the fairgoer. But when they weren't exploring the fair or being an exhibit, they were playing basketball. And they were there for several months, and they won every single exhibition game, every scrimmage. I mean, they were making noise on their own. Other people were coming to watch. Geronimo came, the Native American legend, and that was really exciting. Helen Keller came to see them, experience them. But celebrities were coming out to watch them. Like, this was a big deal, and they were like, what is going on? Again, because the newspapers talking about how they're unstoppable, speedier, more agile. My opponents just couldn't match it. And I mean, again, they're just out here smoking everybody. Like 12, 13-year-old girls just running past everyone. At the same time, there's a lot of noise going on in St. Louis at this time. St. Louis was also holding the Olympics because they wanted more people in their city for some reason. And the Olympics invited these girls to come and perform for an exhibition game. And the girls did, and they received a trophy. But I mean, guys, the WNBA was not even around for another 92 years. And women's basketball wouldn't be involved for another 72 years. So, I mean, they are way ahead of their time before the Caitlin Clarks and Angel Reeses and Lisa Leslies. And again, it filled seats at the St. Louis Arena for these girls to play basketball. Now, that may sound very exciting to folks like us, but Missouri coaches and other organizers weren't too happy. And they thought it was cool for the fanfare, for the media and whatnot, but they had their own notions. And they organized a team of all-star players from all across the state to Missouri to come and play these Fort Shaw Indian basketball schoolgirls. And it was a deliberate, like, we need to stop this savage train. We need to put an end to this media nightmare. We'll just show them once and for all that, again, going back to McGee, and that the whites are superior athletically, academically, etc. This has gone on too far. And it was a best of three. There was nothing else really like it at the time, so the fairgoers called it the World Championship, because it's kind of what it was. There wasn't anything really organized like it is today. Not even anything that we do, World Series for anything in America. It's just American and Canadian teams anyway. But the first game that they played against all these Missouri girls, they won 24-2. Right, just ran through them, man. And the Missouri All-Stars, they didn't like that, and they actually didn't show up to the second game. And yeah, right? And then the Fort Shaw girls were like, no, we didn't come all this way just to have an asterisk, We're not going to do this. We're going to play a second game, and we're going to be rightful champions, and they did. They defeated the Missouri team 17-6, and it cemented their record as the undisputed world champion. So, this is from family members, thank you. They sent it to the library, and I wanted to make sure I included. I also appreciate that they're colorized. Artie Cecil, granddaughter of Lizzie Worth and great niece of Nettie Worth. Thank you. They had a family meetup a few years ago at Fort Shaw. And so a lot of the family members brought artwork and memorabilia. Thank you to submitting it to the library so I could add it to the slides. So at this fair that was entirely predicated on white imperialism and showing how awesome America is and why everybody needs the benevolent white Christian to come and save the day, and playing a Christian American game, basketball, these girls beat them at their own game. Right? They came through, they learned, they picked it up, they competed, they worked hard, they practiced all the time. And and show the world that their spirit could not be killed. It's also a really important story about sort of how you take a group of people that otherwise were enemies and you put them all on the same team, and then you give them a goal, not just in sports, but you give them a platform. What can happen with people, how barriers can be crossed. And like I said, it was a direct rebuke of the rhetoric of McGee. Like, I mean, to play this way, to get this attention, to win the world championship, and as when you were originally invited to be an exhibitor next door to a lab that showed skeletons and brains of how your people are inferior to others, and to come out and win the world championship, it was really quite a story. And all of this, again, going back to how extraordinary, it all came together almost like in just the timing, the dominoes of it. You had basketball that had just been invented not 2 decades before. You had the different attitudes that were going on with sending kids to the boarding schools, better quality of boarding school for Fort Shaw. You also had people like Coach Campbell that was like, this is wrong, let's just keep these girls safe, or these kids safe and healthy and help them to have a good education, but we're not Colonel, we're not Captain Pratt, we're not trying to be abusive here. And then of course you have the St. Louis World's Fair, so all of this is coming together, all the dominoes are coming together for this team to come to get together. And that's all in the midst of ethnic cleansing and cultural genocide. This idea that the spirit can never be killed. So, and then finally, I mentioned earlier the mixed tribe team and how it's an indicator, not even a century later, how many tribes came together to form a pan-Native American political power. In a weird way, by Americanizing and teaching so many people English, it broke down all of their barriers to then collectively come together. So, may the Indian boarding school survivors and their family feel that their story was respectfully told, feel honored and heard. May the young girls be inspired to continue their love of basketball, to learn about basketball history, women's sports history, and may the intersection of politics and sports continue to bring justice to all. Here are my sources. Do you have any questions, feedback, comments?
Fort Shaw is also the furthest Indian school from Washington, D.C. So they didn't want to trek out. The politicians, except Paris Gibson, who was a senator here, and he was instrumental in just saying, hey, there's a school out in my state, it's unbelievable. And so it's a political thing. And the other interesting thing is that James Sullivan was overseeing the Olympics. The Sullivan Award is the National Amateur Athlete of the Year now. That's the same guy. And he got pestered so much by Campbell, you gotta come see my girls, you gotta come see my girls, you gotta come see my girls, that he came over and watched them scrimmage. And that infiltrated into them being invited. But they could not, he didn't mention, he said exhibition, but it's important to know they could not play a public game. They could only play an exhibition. It's a great story. This is just an unbelievable story.
It really is, and like nobody knows about it. Montanans do. But yeah, thank you so much for filling in.
I'm just excited.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to fill in the question. It's just it's an exciting story. I'm a Hoosier, so basketball's important to Hoosier.
And then if you hear the story independently, like, oh yeah, these girls went and played at the St. Louis World's Fair and they played basketball and they won. You're like, okay. And then you're like, no, you got to know what was going on. I mean, it was a big deal.
Campbell was superintendent of schools.
Yes.
He wasn't just the coach. He was the superintendent of schools.
Yeah. Which also goes to show how many hats. Very thin staff, right? And the retention rate for teachers was atrocious.
Yeah.
So a lot of kids, and I see your question. I was surprised to learn at what they prioritized in the education. And it was very basic math, but then they went straight into civil rights, constitution, private property, naming American government leaders. Like it was very much Americanization, which I thought was, like you read it and you're like, wow, like, what do third graders need to know about private property? So.
I just wanted to add, you were talking about when parents began to sort of give up and say, okay, another factor in that was that if you don't let your children go to school, then we will not give you any of the things that by treaty we have to give you, like food. And so it was a question of, does the whole family starve, or do you let the kid go off to boarding school?
Absolutely. Yeah, there was pressure on all sides. I can't imagine, because it's not a decision, right? Right. When starvation is one of the options. Thank you, I appreciate it. Yes, ma'am.
I just can't imagine that there weren't repercussions in the white community after this. And I can just see, okay, the game is physical and it's mental. Okay, we see the physical part of it. It must just be sort of a dumb game. You know what I mean? In other words, they can do it, and their physical can overcome the white physicality, but our white girls are much smarter.
Right. Right, yeah. Yeah, there is all sorts of repercussions that came from this. Because it also inspired so many girls, right? There were so many white girls that were like, yeah, I want to play like the Fort Shaw girls. Like, I want to throw an elbow. Let's play. So you have that, like trying to stifle this new inspiration. And because of how successful they were, other girls, well, I can play sports, I can do track. Like, what do you mean? Like it did, and so it like started a whole thing. On the other hand, there's different stories with how, because on one hand, these Fort Shaw Indian, the basketball team was being celebrated. That doesn't mean that the rest of the school was doing great. In fact, several of the girls, their siblings, ran away from the school because the school, they hated it. They wanted to be home. One of the girls, her brother died running away. So this idea that like, oh, well, just because Fort Shaw girls basketball team, it must mean that everything's inclusive and hunky-dory. No, it just means that there was a basketball team that managed to get some success and found their own light. But the rest of the school was still in the same situation, eating beans or whatever government subsidized food they got, those girls were 12 to 17 years old. That was kind of like what your classes looked like. You could be in class with an 8-year-old. So the divisions of education were not great. Yes?
With Campbell being a reasonable guy, was there a cemetery at Fort Shaw as well? Were there beatings of the kids and, dead children and so forth at Fort Shaw,
Like, I don't know if there's a formal cemetery. I know that their children died at Fort Shaw. I don't know if there's a recognized cemetery.
I believe they came back and surveyed the area and have actually sent the remains back to their reservation.
And what did you say? I can't hear the last part. What did they find something?
Yes, they did. Ken Robeson probably has the knowledge. And he's done a lot of research because he is from that area.
So there's about 12 kids and they're in the military cemetery.
Yeah, the one that's just down the road.
To my knowledge, none of the kids were dug up and sent any place. But all of them, all the graves are marked and also with their tribe.
I was just going to say, you were talking about him empowering the girls to make that decision. There was more than just going, too, because the commitment to practice, to travel and all that, they didn't go home for 2 years. Those girls did not go home for 2 years. And then when they did go home, there was the issue they really weren't white and they really weren't Indian. And it was a big deal for the kids' identities.
Yes. absolutely. There are some stories where the girls never talked about them even going to St. Louis, which is wild to consider. Like, you went to St. Louis, Missouri, and you're from Montana. Anything in Montana is like St. Louis, Missouri. It's basically not the World's Fair, and didn't even talk about it until later, or until maybe other stories were released. And like you said, they weren't white, they weren't Indian, and also that part was intentional. If you look at government documents, they'll say that, like, we'll make it so that they can't come home. They'll have been too Americanized that they won't be accepted by their communities. Another thing that the American government has done is blood quantum. That's now, like, because that's intentional, blood quantum will eventually run out. That's very hard to find two quote-unquote pure bloods and conceive and reproduce. And so the idea is that, yeah, you'll have funding or you'll have these resources so long as you have this blood quantum, with the very intention that that blood quantum will run out. So it's a question of how our Indigenous community is going to handle that in the generations to come, because within 100 years, that will have wiped people out, and identity-wise. So there's only one other thing that in America we really look at for blood quantum, and that's dogs, American kennel dogs, AKC. So to compare Indigenous people to dogs is something only the American government's really capable of.
So Campbell was also native.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that the basketball that they played was based on a native sport that was similar. Could it be surmised that their experience with that gave them a leg up?
Probably. Yeah. The fact that it was that female athleticism was valued, that they had access to play games like that when a lot of white girls didn't. So a lot of, they either, knowing how to play a game that was similar, and then also growing up being allowed to be physical and athletic. Paul first.
Well, this isn't a question, it's just a comment. That went on for a long time. Like, I'm older than you are. When I went to high school, no organized girls' sports. Zero. If you were rich, you played tennis or skied. That's it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, there's sewing and typing.
Right. Right, and it's wild. I'm still working on the presentation and paper now, and you'll be the first to know. But I'm looking at military women of history and women that were military leaders from as old as the Shang Dynasty, all the way to Joan of Arc, and etc. And like this idea that women aren't supposed to be athletic is not at all what history has told us. And so it's very interesting. I'm still working on it, but you have a question.
Yeah, do we have any data about how their day worked in terms of, they were in school still, right?
Mm-hmm.
With their special times in their practice, they just between things, do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so they were definitely students first. They woke up in the morning, marched, which is crazy to imagine, like marching from their bunks or from their quarters, bunks, however you want to call it, to the facilities. They did do school, but again, like you pointed out, they did a lot of sewing or like any sort of domestic work. And then they would eat and go and practice in the afternoons. They practiced in it used to be the forts. When it was a military base, it was their dance hall, and they converted it to the basketball. So that's where they have the space, was the dance hall.
They did do, I'll say, exhibition games along the High Line.
Yeah.
And the room they played in Port Benton is still there.
Yeah. That is it that big one that's over behind the elementary school?
Second floor of one of the buildings on Main Street.
Okay.
I've never been there.
Just one more question for you, Lee. A little bit about what they played in. Would you, because it looked like it was heavy and hot when they were playing outside. Were the other competitors playing in those types of jerseys too? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, girls' sports was pretty much dresses and bloomers underneath. I mean, we can even look at something like figure skating now is still skirts and dresses, gymnastics. Like a lot of what you see in female sports uniforms and outfits was not the way. It's very feminized to dresses and skirts with shorts underneath.
And they were wool.
Yes,
Yeah.
that was my next thing, was wool.
In St. Louis, and the humidity, that was what struck with me when I read the book.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's hard to live there with air conditioning and cotton clothing. So those young ladies playing basketball in wool.
And it wasn't on concrete either. Like the way we imagine basketball, like this was like in grass. Like the basketball, the quality of the basketball was not these Wilson basketballs we have today, or Spalding, that's right, sorry. It was a completely different game. The other thing was too, when basketball was introduced to girls, they played half court, and the Fort Shaw girls rejected that. They were like, we're playing full court. Like, we're going all the way.
What do you mean, we played half court in high school?
So Lee, this was great.
Mhm.
Do you think about turning it into a book?
I don't know, because P.D. and Smith wrote the
Yeah,
gospel
no,
on it.
it doesn't need to be this, you know.
Yeah, I would like to maybe
For
turn it
young
in.
girls, like that.
Oh, I
girls.
see. Possibly, yeah. There's, yeah, I mean, that would be cool. Or even like I said earlier, I would love to see a Disney Remember the Titans version of it. You know, you can so see Lily Gladstone or someone taking the charge, just like a Montana indigenous woman. But you can tell I thought a lot about this. This is who will cast. But yeah, right now I am still like just trying to present and like publicize it more in the most respectful way I can too. So great idea, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Lee, do you or have you done school presentations?
Yes, not like collegiate level, like what do you mean by that? I'm sorry.
Like the Great Falls Public Schools?
Oh, that'd be awesome. Yeah, we could talk. Like,
Okay.
that would be cool.
Thank you.
So one of the buckskin dresses that the girls wore to St. Louis is in the museum at U of M.
Oh, is it?
It was the shortest player. The dress is about this tall,
Mm,
mini.
that's cool. Aw,
The jokester.
Yeah, they actually brought it for that family reunion
yeah.
that was at the fort and had it on display. They had brought their own guards.
They, it's a story, and it launched him. I mean, there's a PBS documentary that, of course, adds a lot of visuals that you can't do with a 35 slide thing. And I'm pretty impressed that you guys went the distance with me, because the paper itself was something like almost 10,000 words. Thank you to Jake for editing. But yeah, I came across the story, started doing my own research and writing, and then when I saw the North American Society of Sports History, they had a contest, and I looked through all the winners and the previous winners, and there were certainly winners that talked about women's sports, you know, Billie Jean King, or just any like, or I mean, sort of like quote unquote social justice-y type things, but there were hardly any indigenous. There was Jim Thorpe. But there weren't a lot of indigenous representation, and so I was like, well, let's go, let's do this. And I just thought it was a good year too to bring this up with Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese and the rise of the WNBA. Also with so much coming out about the boarding schools from Canada, and then also recently, not this presidential administration, but the last, did apologize to the Gila Reservation down in Arizona. So I was like, okay, there's never been a time in history that's it's really like there's much energy going towards it. Let's.
And there were two massive reports that came out of the, when Deb Holland was Secretary of the Interior, 2 long reports on boarding schools.
Yes,
And they're available, they're online, anybody can read them.
yeah,
They're really, really impressive.
yeah. Let me see some.
So one of the male students out of the boarding school went on to become a renowned sousaphone player. And he was there with his sister. His sister passed away at school.
Okay, wow. Thank you for sharing that.
I can send, there's a guy that did like a 35-page paper on this guy. I mean, he was famous.
Wow, okay, thank you. Yeah, as mentioned, I did Linda Peavy and Ursula Smith in alphabetical order, but the Native American Rights Fund has really nice, easy-to-read graphics with all the stats, if you have any questions about it. And then this Jones, Dan Sesua, Stealing Little Moon, he wrote a children's book about the Indian boarding schools. So if going down a research rabbit hole is a little too much, you can always read children's books about it. But thank you so much for coming out today. I so appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. I hope that you're going to walk away with a little bit more knowledge and information, which is what we do here at the Great Falls Public Library. We always have programs going on here. Thursday, we're going to be traveling to Spain with the Martin family for our Armchair Traveler series, so come on out for that. That'll be 7 o'clock, and they actually bought snacks over in Spain, and they're going to bring them in for us, so that's pretty cool. And then Leigh's going to be back out in a couple weeks for another presentation, a practice presentation for a big old presentation that how many times can I say presentation in one sentence? That she has later on next month. So that is going to be the 24th?
Whatever the Monday is it 24th or
I think it's
23rd? Something.
Something like that.
Look on
Yeah.
Facebook.
Yeah.
24th.
It's on our calendar as well. So come out for that as well, because we're sure to learn a lot more information about the world with another Leigh Larson presentation. So thank you all again, and travel safe. Please take the elevator. As we just heard, the alarm is still on for the exits. Take the elevator.